Okay.
Okay, please continue.
Okay. Good afternoon to one and all present here. And I'm Raunak Roy. I am speaking from India. I am from University of Hyderabad, and the topic that I'm going to present on is folklore of the Asur community, an aid to language learning and preservation. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So since here all the scholarly people have gathered, I don't need to say anything about or define an endangered language. Scholars are sitting here. Mm, but I would like to say and speak about one particular endangered language which is spoken in a state of India that is called Jharkhand, and it has been designated as a definitely endangered language by UNESCO. The name of the language is Asuri, and the name of the speech community is Asurs. Asurs speak the language called Asuri, and it is a definitely endangered language. Okay, next slide, please, ma'am. Okay, now in books we find that traditional reasons given why a language is or may be endangered. So, and this process of endangerment may be gradual or it may be fast. So, the traditional reasons that are given are war, genocide, natural disasters, cultural, political, and economic marginalization, lack of intergenerational transfer, language attitudes, and even for economic reasons, a language may become endangered. But here, when we look in the case of this particular language, we see that it has some a little bit different reasons why it is becoming endangered. First of all, we see that the number of the speakers, Asuri speakers of this community is very small. Um, um, though this Asuri people reside in some other states also, Chhattisgarh and West Bengal, but this study, this research that has been undertaken is focused on the Asurs which reside in the state of Jharkhand. Okay, and another point is that these people live in the forest, only in the forest, and in the forests which are situated at the top of the hills. So, not to talk about town, they are even isolated from other villages also, because they live high up on the hills, and they have no connectivity by mobile phones, or there is no connectivity by roads. So they are in a state of complete or almost complete isolation. So these are the factors which have led this language to be limited to a particular geographical region and a particular population, and it has not been able to come in touch with the other uh, uh, people and languages of that state. Second, another next slide, please. Okay, now to talk something about the language and the people. Okay, before I speak anything about language, I would like to clarify that the word tribal I am using here, I only mean to say that I use it to mean indigenous, nothing else, nothing derogatory, nothing pejorative. I only mean to say, when I say tribal, I mean indigenous. If I say tribal language, I mean indigenous language. If I say tribal people, I mean indigenous people. Okay, I'm using it in that context. Asurs are one of the many tribal groups of the state of Jharkhand. As I said earlier, this research has been done on the state of Jharkhand, and they are regarded as the most ancient tribe to inhabit this region. And as I already said in the previous slides, that they are found in other states also, but this research is particularly focusing on those Asurs who reside in the state of Jharkhand. Next slide, please. Now, the state of Jharkhand was carved out of the state of Bihar for the tribal people, for the indigenous people. Now, the state of Jharkhand has 32 tribes, and out of these 32 tribes, uh, 8 of them fall under the PVTG group. Now, what is this PVTG? PVTG is particularly vulnerable tribal group. Uh, they were classified under the Debar Commission 1960-61 so as to better facilitate their growth on par with other STs on a national scale. PVTGs means that out of the total 32 tribes, these 8 tribes which have been identified, they are even more vulnerable than the other tribes that are there. So they have been identified and classified as a separate category. The characteristics of this PVTGs include pre-agricultural system of existence, the practice of hunting, they practice hunting or gathering, zero or negative population growth, extremely low level of literacy, and absence of a written language. That means that their language exists only in the oral form. Now, earlier, anthropologists and scholars have conducted anthropological and ethnographic studies on this community. One such person is Hoffman, and Hoffman in his Encyclopedia Mundarica describes this community in the following words. The Asurs are a rapidly disappearing branch of some aboriginal race represented now only by some small groups of a few families spread through the hills and forests of Sarjuga, Jashpur, Daltonganj district, and here and there in the Ranchi district. So, see, this we find that's the fact of there being a very vulnerable minority speech community. Next slide, please. Now, just briefly, I will say that they are classified into three subgroups: the Bir Asur, the Birji Asur, and the Agaria Asur. And this study is focused on Bir Asurs, and they have a totemic clan-based system, and clan exogamy is the norm. There's no. Okay, next slide, please, ma'am. Okay. Here, see in this map, we can see that there is an ghagra. Just I don't have the pointer to point out, but we can see a ghagra. There is one. Yes, there. That is the area where the field. Oh, sorry. That is the area where the field work was conducted. Okay, next slide, please. Huh. So yeah, that was the map showing the district where the field work was conducted, and I have said these things. Next slide, please. Now, to speak something more about the language, Asuri is the Munda language of the Austro-Asiatic family. It belongs to the North Munda group. And Grierson, in his Linguistic Survey of India, classifies it as a dialect of Kherwari, and two forms two principal forms of which are Santali and Mundari. And as I have said since the beginning, that this language exists only in the oral form. It doesn't have a script of its own. Next slide, please. Now, current scenario, something about the current status of the language. Okay, I have already said this many times. It does not have its own script. It does not have its own literature. It does not have any grammar book written on the language, and there is lack of formal education in the language. The children of the Asur community are educated in the language, in the official language of the state, which is Hindi. Uh, and there is no printed media existing in this language. Next slide, please. There is no television program either. The younger generation, especially the school-going children and the college-going children, they do not have, they do not use those lexical items related to indigenous flora and fauna, including medicinal plants, festivals, games, food habits, counting systems, names of season, etc., etc. Gradual, there was seen that there is a gradual disappearance of their old age traditional cultural practices in the form of folk songs, folk dance, proverbs, folk medication, fishing, hunting, craftsmanship, games, and political system. And as I said earlier, they have an extremely small number of speakers, and liberal. Now there is a great influence of regional language. The regional language spoken there is Sadri and Nagpuriya. These languages are making way into the lexicon of this language, and the younger generation, the school-going kids and college-going students are getting more influenced by these regional languages. And this Asuri is being highly influenced by the dominant language, that is Sadri. Next slide, please, ma'am. Now, to talk of education, currently, since 1931 to 2001, the literacy percentage is extremely low, and even the most recent census also says that the literacy rate of this community is only 20%. Next slide, ma'am. Now, coming back to my main topic, folklore. See, the domains where folklore is used frequently. See, Asuri is one such community where there is prevalent use of folk songs for in every day, in day-to-day life, and in uh, if any festival is there, if any custom is there, you singing of folk songs is mandatory. So some of the occasions where you see this uh, folk songs being used are like when there is a sacrifice, when there is worship, folk songs are sung during festivals. Not only songs, there is dance also. And in case of marriage, they, if it is an arranged marriage, then since the start of the matchmaking process till the completion of the marriage, you will see any number of folk songs being sung by the family and friends. And then we have during the time of agriculture, during the time of sowing and during the time of harvesting, songs are sung by men and women. And then when somebody dies, we Asurs practice burial, so they go and bury the person. They that time also they have lamentation songs which is sing. Then apart from songs, there are stories regarding creation, stories for children, and then there is myths. And then during iron extraction, I will continue with this last point in the next slide also. Next slide, ma'am. Yes, Asurs were the first in the world to produce iron. During this research, I have come up with this finding. Uh, Even I did not know before about this, that the Asurs are the first people who produced iron manually, not like today how it is produced in the companies with the help of instruments, with the help of something, but they produce it manually. This fact is attested in even by archaeologists and by other scholars. So, the Asura.
Hi, Raunak. Sorry, I don't want to
Yes,
interrupt you. I just wanted to warn you that the next talk is due to start in about 3 minutes. So I
yes,
know you
ma'am.
had to start late, but I just like maybe just a couple of minutes left. Is that okay?
Okay, okay, ma'am. It is okay.
Okay.
Next slide, ma'am. Yeah, here is the picture. You can see they know how to identify the stones, particular stones which have the iron ore. And they, above, I have written the indigenous terms for that: Sarsi, Kutasi, Bichi, Tuku. Okay, next slide, ma'am. And then they have this furnace where they produce iron. Next slide, ma'am. Okay, here I have noted the one folk song which they sing while smelting iron. Okay, next slide, ma'am. Okay, now since iron is being produced by companies, this art is coming to an end. So, um, and next slide, ma'am. Now, language policy in the state of Jharkhand. Okay, I would sum this up in one line that Jharkhand is a state of tribal languages. Many tribal languages are there, but the language which is chosen for as a state language is Hindi. It is not the language of these tribes. So, what happens is that uh, uh, in fact, one of the very unique thing about Jharkhand is that speakers of three different language families, they have been staying in this state and they have assimilated and formed a very good culture. So there is diversity of language speakers, but the children of the tribal are educated in the language of the state. So this is causes the problem of semi-lingualism. Next slide, ma'am. Yeah, I have said this. Next slide, ma'am. Oh, yeah, next slide, ma'am. Yeah, so the policy adopted by the government of Jharkhand results in the problem what we call as semi-lingualism. Here we see that uh, though this research on semi-lingualism has been conducted in other states, but it is yet to be done in Jharkhand, and children they end up losing even what they know, and they are not able to learn anything their other language. Next slide, ma'am. So, see, the problem with this is that there is a double burden. You have to teach a concept that is new to child, and you have to teach that concept in a language that the child doesn't know. So there is a foreign language angle and there is a new concept angle. So we have to work on this, how to solve this problem. Next slide, ma'am.
Hi, Raunak. I'm really sorry. This is fascinating, and I think that everyone would really like to hear more about it, but I think we have to stop now so that we can carry on with the rest of the panel.
I think, ma'am, it is the last slide.
Last slide? Okay.
Okay. So here folklore comes to the rescue. If we are using folklore to teach another language, English or Hindi to the child, so that is beneficial. Why? Ma'am, next slide. I think that would be the last slide. Yeah, because it is a language learner friendly to use folk tales to teach another language. See, there are so many characteristics we can see that enable the child to grasp the concepts faster. Okay, ma'am, I had pictures also after my at the end of the slides. Can you show that?
Raunak, what I would
We
suggest is,
can't.
I'm so
No.
sorry, but what I would suggest is that if we please like stay around, and if we have any time at the end of the whole panel,
Okay.
then like people, please keep your questions in mind. I know Radu had a question, and it was really fascinating. I'm sorry that the technical issues, you know, kind of made you lose some of your time. But I'm glad that we got to hear it at least, because it was really interesting, and I know that people will want to discuss it with you in the breaks. So I'm sorry to cut you off, and thank you so much for that. And we're just going to go straight on to the next talk in the panel. So this is a panel 10 on language and tradition. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the background. She's excited about language and tradition. So our first speaker is Peter Austin from SOAS University of London, who is going to be speaking about developing Bayungu language and culture awareness for a marine park. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lily. Let's try and share the screen. I hope you can see my slideshow. Yep, okay. So we're going to be talking about Bayungu and the connections to developments with a major marine park in Australia. If anyone's interested, I will put the slides here on my website, www.peterkaustin.com, and they will be shared and made available to everybody through Creative Commons license. So the topics I want to cover, I'll introduce the language and culture, talk a little bit about some of the linguistic research that I've been involved in since I first started this project work in 1978. I'll introduce Ningaloo Marine Park and Kardabaya Station to you. Then talk a bit about the joint management agreement which has emerged over the last 2 years. I mean, literally the latest developments in this area actually happened last month. So this is very topical. We'll have a look at some of the language component that might form part of these developments, particularly looking at tourism and how language might play a role in tourist developments here, together with ranger training, that is training of the rangers who are working in the marine park area. I'll briefly mention the research methods that I've been using and show you some preliminary outcomes from the work. In a way, this report today is actually too early in the sense that the project began last year, and I was actually supposed to be in Australia right now. We had planned for me to spend 3 months in Western Australia and working on this community project, but due to COVID-19, I have not been able to leave the UK. So actually I haven't been able to get permission to enter Australia. As some of you may know, Australia has extremely strict COVID restrictions, and outsiders cannot get permission to enter the state of Western Australia. And then finally, I'll briefly mention some current developments and some of the plans that we might have for the future. So in the 19th century, when Australia was being colonized, there was something like 350 different languages spoken throughout the whole of the continent and Tasmania. We're going to concentrate on an area on the mid coast of Western Australia, roughly where the arrow is located. And in this area, we find a number of languages that can be classified into different language families. And the language we're we'll be talking about today is called Bayungu. On this map, it's spelt with a P, but P and B are not phonemically distinct. Voicing is not a contrast here, so don't be surprised by the difference. So those Bayungu and its neighboring languages, Budana and Thalangi, are related as members of a Kanyara group, and you can see the names of the other languages in that area. So linguistic research on Bayungu and other languages began in 1958 with a survey of basic vocabulary by Geoffrey O'Grady, the late Geoffrey O'Grady. And then in 1967, he and the famous late Kenneth Hale did basic data collection right up and down the coast of Western Australia. So we have vocabulary and sentence elicitations from many of the languages of this region. Not all of them, but many of them. And there's quite a lot of Bayungu material in that collection. I started work in this area in 1978 and continued doing field work there until 1994. By that time, my main language teachers had all passed on. So it was really difficult. And I had various other things, including eventually moving to London. So my work there involved elicitation and text collections in 6 of the languages, mostly in the Kanyara and Manthara language groups, together with basic data on 3 languages. That includes sort of basic word lists and sentence structures. So I'll show you in a second some comparisons that give you a hint of what we're talking about. If you're interested, there's more information on the project work that I've been doing on 2 websites, which I have developed in the last few months. One of the joys of COVID has been, and being stuck here in London, is that I've actually been producing quite a lot of material and developing web resources. So you can have a look at these 2 websites. Perhaps somebody could type those into the chat as we go along. So yingara.org and jiwali.com. You can find links to these also from my personal website. So please have a look at that material. So here's an example. This is just some vocabulary and a bit of grammatical stuff. And you can see, just looking down, the first 3 languages, Bayungu, Thalangi, and Budana, are quite closely related. They belong to the Kanyara group, and Taragari, Jiwali belong to the Manthara group. So you can see Taragari has borrowed the word for person. Bayungu has a uniquely different form here. Budana has a uniquely different form. The first person possessive in Thalangi is a suppletive form, which is quite different from the rest of the paradigms. And then quite strikingly, Budana has a totally an innovative second person singular pronoun, while the Manthara languages have innovated a second person singular pronoun by repurposing the root, which in the Kanyara languages is a second person plural. So quite interesting linguistically, the languages are close, but they have quite a number of differences that make each of them unique. Now, 2 years ago, I went back to Western Australia. I knew that I was about to retire from SOAS, so I resumed contact with the communities on a private visit and went back to visit to see what the situation was like after not being there for about 20 years, and made connections with people and so on. And then last year, I got involved in a dictionary project for the language Yingara, which is spoken in around the town of Carnarvon. And I visited again and held various community meetings really opportunities for different groups of people to get together and have a look at some of the possibilities to explore opportunities, thinking about language awareness, possibilities for revitalization. People are really keen to get the younger generations engaged and looking at ways in which different alternatives that might be possible. And as part of that, I contacted the people that I had connections with in the Bayungu community. So as I said earlier, I had planned to be there right now actually, but this COVID prevented that. So today, right now, Bayungu has 2 fluent speakers. They are 2 women who are the daughters of one of my main teachers in the 1970s and 80s when I did my field work. And there are some semi-speakers, including the granddaughter, so the daughter of the daughters of my main teacher. So let's move on to Ningaloo. This is a major marine park. The name Ningaloo comes from the Bayungu word Ningaloo, which means nose. You'll see why when we have a look at the map in a moment. It's actually the largest accessible fringing reef in Australia, much larger than the more famous Great Barrier Reef, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Right in the middle of this is a small town, which is a major tourist destination. The reef is visited by 110,000 visitors each year, although they're limited to just 5,000 at any given time. It has campsites and motels, but the only permanent building is accommodation for the people who work in the town, and this actually is owned by the Bayungu community. So here you can see the reef, which is just off the coast in Western Australia. So it stretches along this massive area here, hundreds of kilometers up and down, and it's so close to the coastline. You can quite literally see it, and it's very, very easy and very accessible. So this whole area, all in blue here, is a marine park, UNESCO listed, and you can see why it's called nose because of the shape that it occupies going up here. Now, the Bayungu people are associated with this area, and this is roughly what it looks like. It's home for huge manta rays, whale sharks, and this is what the reef looks like. It's utterly spectacular, and you can see why it's a major tourist destination. Now, Kardabaya Station in Bayungu, Kardabaya, is 2,000 square kilometers pastoral station, which is owned by the Bayungu Aboriginal Corporation. They purchased it in 1997, and through the court system, a native title determination was assigned to the Bayungu people just in December last year. So a couple of months after I visited last year, they got the determination, and they now own the whole of that area. And then just last month, there was a final agreement to a land use agreement between the Bayungu and their neighbours, the Talanji, with the West Australian government to create a coastal reserve. And this is an area that runs between the waterline and approximately 1 kilometre inland, all along the coast. And it's a conservation area that covers the whole of that sort of north-south region that I mentioned. So what you see here, this is the reef in blue, the Reef National Park, and then along the dashed area here is the coastal reserve that's just been newly created. And this area, 2,000 square kilometers, right by Coral Bay, is Bayungu-owned land on Kardabaya. So all of the territory that's in the orange, light orange here, is Aboriginal territory. So this is Bayungu, and to the north is where the Talanji take place. So last year I was invited to get involved in a project which was at that time the development of a joint management plan for these new coastal reserves. And as I mentioned just now, the coastal reserves were finally approved and signed off just last month. So here we are visiting. This is the members of the Bayungu Corporation governing body. And probably the most important person in the photograph here is a lady called Hazel Walgar. And Hazel is the daughter of one of my main teachers in the 1970s and 80s. She's an incredibly incredible individual. She speaks her father's language fluently, and she has studied some linguistics and is literate in Bayungu. And all these books and tapes that you see here on this table that are actually Hazel's materials. So she has, she's in collaboration with colleagues at the Wongamaya Aboriginal Language Centre, has produced dictionaries, little books for children, basic expressions and so on. So the coastal reserve, in the newly developed coastal reserve involves a number of activities, mapping and documentation of sites that are significant traditionally, having dual signage in Bayungu and English, fencing off and protection of vulnerable areas, training of rangers, particularly some younger Indigenous people who are being trained, and new development that we could call ethnotourism. These are commercial operations that
5 minutes, Peter. 5 minutes, okay?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Okay.
Commercial operations that focus on taking tourists out to the park and to the conservation zone, as well as Kartabaya Station. And they have tag-along tours where they take four-wheel drive people, yarning circle, which is sitting around talking to traditional owners, and camping on traditional sites. So here we are with some of the joint signage. You can see this is Parks and Wildlife vehicles, and then the signage is being assigned. A couple of months ago, they started a presence on Facebook, and there's some very nice videos. I won't have time to show these, but there's a really nice video on that Facebook site showing their activities. And this is a recent photograph of some satisfied customers who went on one of the drives with the people, and had a nice cook up afterwards and enjoyed kangaroo and various other traditional foods. So what about language resources? How do they fit into the picture here? Well, most language awareness or revitalization materials focus on learning things like interaction, how to say hello, how to say goodbye, how are you going, where are you, kinship terms, body parts, basic activities, counting. And this is really not relevant for a tourist audience. So I tried to look for some existing resources, but with only limited success. So far, I've only been able to find a very limited amount, but through the assistance of Sue Hansen at the Goldfields Language Centre in Western Australia, I was able to find some really relevant materials that I think we are going to look at and see if we can adapt them. So if you'll give me just one more minute, I will quickly show you what these look like. So one of the things that they've done is done mapping and use QR codes attached to signage. And of course, we can do this in the Bayungu case because their signage is being put in there, and it's simply a case of adding QR codes to those signs so that people can scan them with their mobile phone, and they will be able to listen to people telling a story or hear the language. In the Goldfields, they have a trail of art galleries with Aboriginal art, and they produced a map where this is all mapped out. And very popular has been a large poster map with embedded audios in it. And these play 1-minute recordings of people speaking in language. And as Sue says, the tourists stand and push every single button and listen to the information in the stories. So this is what the map looks like. And each of those red buttons, you push it and you hear language, somebody speaking, telling language. So the tourists are then exposed, given some basic information about the language situation. And they also have developed interactive emotion charts where, again, you press the button. And interestingly, Sue says, tourists love this chart. They often stand and listen over and over again to learn words. So these are some of the inspirations of some of the possible developments that we might be going on to. Now, one of the things that we did start last year, I did some participant observation, went out, spent a few days with the rangers traveling around, and they wanted some language lessons. How can we learn to use the language? We want to be able to do this in our daily lives and also with the tourists. So I observed, and the question is, well, what do you guys want to learn? And the very first thing that came up was dig faster. So, and there's a lot of traveling, as you saw in vehicles, and so there's a lot of traffic on two-way radio. So I'm going from here to there. So I developed some little lessons in positive and negative imperatives, ablative, allative, and locative case encoding, verbs of movement and action, and basic morphology, introducing ideas of verb conjugations so that they can learn how to say dig faster, sit down, come here, and so on. So you can see here's some of the sort of stuff that's being introduced. Don't you sit down, dig faster, you two. So, and this was, the rangers got really excited and interested, and overnight when between the lessons that I was giving them, they were actually writing on their whiteboard and their refrigerator sentences and practicing. So I conclude that this is a highly under-researched, as I believe it's an under-researched area for Indigenous languages, but it's one that has potential for sharing language knowledge and possibly revitalization. Tourists are keen for authentic experiences, and the introduction of languages into this area actually makes them part of a cash economy. And the young people can see their language and culture esteemed by the tourists and economically valuable. The rangers were enthusiastic. We need to develop some concrete outcomes, and sometimes just sit there and be quiet and listen. And the personalities and the timing really important. You might need to wait 42 years for possibilities to develop, but sometimes wonderful things can happen. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for a really fascinating talk and an insight into, like you said, a very under-researched and under-examined area of language revitalization. Have we got any questions? Please put them in the chat. And if not, I've got a question, but I'll just wait a minute to see if anyone would like to ask something first. We have a few minutes for questions.
While we're waiting, Lily, if anybody attending the conference or any of their friends know of situations where this kind of information for tourists is being prepared, please let me know, because I'm really fascinated to know what sorts of things are happening elsewhere in the world.
So, okay, so Julia's asked a question, which is actually, I mean, kind of related to what I wanted to ask. So Julia asks, can tourists save your language? And what I was wondering is whether or not this initiative is kind of connected in any way, or are there plans to sort of connect it to revitalization efforts for children? Because it looked like a lot of the activities, obviously you mentioned children and how it has a positive effect on the, you know, like self-esteem and regard for the language. But are there any like kind of sort of official tie-ins with like developing materials for immersion programs or for children?
Okay, The first thing to say is tourists are not going to save the language. To me, this is an opportunity to bring the languages out into public, to make them so obvious. You know, for example, at the entry to the entrance to the town now, the town of Coral Bay has a huge sign on it that says, "You are now in Bayungu country." You know, and this is very, very recent. This is what's happened in the last year or two. So these are the very, very first steps, showing people that the language is there, that there are people who speak it, and then that is going to raise people's perceptions and attitudes more generally. You know, I don't see the children as the immediate first locus of so-called revitalization here. It's actually the young guys. One of the rangers in the photograph there is Hazel's son, and so, you know, he knows a few bits and pieces from his mother, but this is really enthused and encouraged him.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that there were white rangers sitting at that table wanting to learn how to speak some words and wanting to learn how to say dig faster was that was a real boost for his sort of sense. And so you know, the locus for encouragement is not the children in the first step. It's the encouragement is for the younger people, and also, you know, it's valorization that is the first step before we talk about other things. Now, the educational situation is very complex because all of those languages are spoken in the schools, and so we can't just choose one language as being the language for revitalization. So, you know, the main punchline that I'm trying to get across is, here is a really unique opportunity in a fantastically spectacular place with a person who speaks her language fluently and is literate, and an opportunity to use that to raise awareness of the language and encourage its development and you know, supporting it. So I'm not using revitalization, I say language support here is the message.
Really, really fascinating. We've got some more questions in the chat. I think we'll just have time for one quick one. Is there a plan to maintain things like public signage? From Christina.
Yeah, so as I said, the Aboriginal community owns the only permanent building in town. So the rest of all the other buildings are leased, and the Aboriginal people own the land now. So, you know, this is a big change. So one of the things that they're planning to do is to put up lots of signs around, you know, maps showing names of sacred places and that kind of thing. So absolutely, the language landscape will shift. You already saw the signage along the beach at those places. Well, that's the first step to actually making the whole place embedded within Bayungu country.
My question was actually, if I may add, that I'm familiar with the situation, so it was very interesting for me, from Kananara in the northwest.
I can't hear a word.
Try again, Christina, I can hear you.
Okay, I'll try to speak more loudly. I'm familiar with the situation from Kananara in the northwest of Western Australia. And they have similar project, but sometimes just due to the weather, like the sun and I don't know what. But sometimes also there was a fire, for example, in one of the places where they had the signage, and these were destroyed. So I was wondering, they only always have short-term funding, and it's difficult to maintain these things. So that was my question, whether there is long-term funding.
Yes, we're familiar with the Kimberley situation, and in fact, some of the rangers from Ningaloo have been up to the national parks up in the Kimberleys. I mean, if you're familiar with that situation, you realize, you know, that a young man who's 20, an Aboriginal man who's 20, the opportunity to go to a totally different place in Australia and engage with other rangers was just fantastic. And they came back so proud and excited, and, positive in terms of their own self-esteem and their own sort of view of the world. Now there's a MOU in place, a memorandum of understanding between the state government through the Parks and Wildlife Service. We are very, very fortunate in this context because we've got a huge marine park with 110,000 tourists every year, right next door to the Aboriginal owned land. So, it's a different situation, I think, from Kimberley's and from other places in Australia. It's unique and really special, but I think that makes it an opportunity. After I've been working here, as I said, for 40 odd years, the first real flickers of possibilities, and the commercial activities are just starting to take off, and they are getting tourists wanting to go and travel and eat the food and experience it.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. And we are now going to move on to our next set of speakers. There are two speakers, Julia Sallabank from SOAS University of London and Candide Simard, University of the South Pacific. And they're going to be speaking about a related environmental topic, how children learn traditional ethnobotanical knowledge in Surin province, Thailand.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter, for that fascinating talk. We have prepared a recording of our presentation that goes with the slides, partly because in case of any problems like we've seen earlier, but also because it's currently 3 o'clock in the morning where Candide is in Fiji, so she's not feeling in the best condition to talk live, but she will be taking questions with me afterwards. So here we go.
Good afternoon, I am Candide Simard. This is a joint presentation with Julia Sallabank. We're going to share with you some of the results of our study on what children know and how children learn about the plants in Bangkanat Pring, a village of Surin province in Thailand.
Hello, this is Julia. This project is multidisciplinary and also international. It's a collaborative project, including linguists based in the UK, Thailand and Fiji, working in collaboration with ethnobotanists as well as, of course, local community members. We work with children, whose role is crucial in the maintenance of the languages and cultures of minority groups, but who are rarely included in studies. Our study contributes an easily reproducible methodology and yields information which establishes a solid basis for maintenance or revitalization initiatives.
This project was created as a response to a wish expressed by the villagers to document the ethnobotanical knowledge of their community. The people in Bangkanat Pring are speakers of Northern Khmer, a language that is spoken by almost 1.5 million people in Thailand, but is nevertheless losing ground as younger speakers are switching to Thai. Although the socio-economic context is changing in the village, the people maintain close ties to the forest. The project comes as a continuation to documentation projects undertaken in the past by the linguists of Rilke at Mahidol University, who devised a Thai-based script for the language. Most of the area around the village is a plateau with periodic lowlands, natural swamps, canals, and water storage pools scattered throughout. The soil is mostly sandy loam, which is suitable for growing rice, and the vicinity is good for raising animals. The community forest is the most important public space. It is named Taka. This is where people are free to hunt and gather and cultivate fruit, vegetables, and herbs. The project has two main aims. The first is to document the plant of the forest and their use, but the documentation is done by the villagers themselves. They receive specialist training that includes collecting specimens, photographing, video, and audio recording their knowledge. The data collected has been processed by research assistants who have created a corpus using Elan and Flex. The second aim is to work out what the children know about the plants and how this knowledge is acquired in order to design better maintenance and revitalization programs. So far, the documentation has yielded a database that contains information about 111 plants and an ethnographic study that has gathered information on how the knowledge of the plants of the forest is transmitted. This is ongoing, but this is also the part of the project we are reporting on today. The second part comprises 3 steps, 3 phases. Step 1 and 2 involve the children themselves. Step 1 is a recognition task. I'll tell you a little bit more on the next slide. And step 2 aims to determine the sources of knowledge about the plants among the children in the village. We conducted semi-structured interviews following a set questionnaire that was administered by the research assistants. Step 3 consists of interviews with the children's families. These were conducted in Thai by Siripan, our colleague at Rilka, and the research assistants. Let's look at the recognition task. It aimed to test how many of the plants in the database the children recognized. 28 children participated during one weekend. We could not pre-select the children. Participation was entirely voluntary. We used all the plants in the database. The children were shown a color picture of each plant token with its name in Northern Khmer, written in the Thai-based script, and its Thai name when available. The children were then given an answer sheet with a list of the plant token numbers and a check box to indicate whether or not they recognized that plant. The pictures were arranged into 5 groups, and the children circulated among the groups. And when they had completed all the plants, they handed in their answer sheet to the research assistant, who recorded their answers into an Excel spreadsheet, and we then used this to conduct statistical analysis. Overall, the children recognized between 21 and 78% of the plant tokens, with an average score of 47%. The plants that were best known are those that are edible, and 3 of the children who scored very highly, with scores of 78, 63, and 69%, are the grandchildren of the traditional healer, and we will come back to that later. Other studies have found that plant names and the traits used to recognize the plants are mainly acquired during childhood. It is also expected that members of the younger generation need time to accumulate ethnobotanical knowledge. However, we found no statistical significance of the factor age on the scores of the children. We then placed the participants into 2 age groups, those 12 years and younger, and those above 12 years. Contrary to our expectations, Bayesian statistical tests indicated that it is extremely likely, 91% likelihood, for the children of group 1, younger children, to correctly identify the plant tokens as opposed to the older children. We also examined gender, as gender-based differences in ethnobotanical knowledge have been reported. But our results show no significant difference between the scores of the boys and the girls. Let's now look at step 2. It followed immediately after the recognition task, the same day. 20 pictures of the best-known plants from the recognition task were shown to the children, who were interviewed by the research assistants according to a set questionnaire. These were open questions, and all the children's answers were noted. We asked them how they knew about the plant, what is the use of the plant, where and when it is found, whether or not it is edible, whether they had tasted the plant before. And we also opened up and asked them to provide any comment that they wanted about the plant. Of particular interest is that during the interviews, when the children gave us a plant name, the plant name was given in Northern Khmer, not in Thai. We found that the children were most likely to identify plants that are used as food or as medicine or as both food and medicine. when children didn't know and couldn't answer, we simply coded none in our data. When asked about where the plants can be found, most often the children did not know. But when they did, they identified 3 major areas: the forest, around their home, or near the water resources. Asked about when the plants were to be found, most children could not answer. Quite wisely, the children seemed to prefer to say they were not sure whether a plant was edible or not, but when they did venture an answer, they told us that it was edible and in most cases they had tasted it. Finally, we asked them how they got to know about the plants, and most said they just know by themselves. When they did provide the source, most often the family was the source that was given. There was a slight preference towards the female members of the family. Note also that grandparents are more often given as the source of knowledge than parents. We even have a great-grandmother. The source of knowledge was of particular interest to us, and to find out more about where and how the children learn about the plants, we conducted in-depth interviews with the participants' families. Here is Julia.
In the third step of the project, we tried to find out what the sources of knowledge are about plants among the children. How do the children learn about plants? So after the recognition task, our Thai colleagues conducted ethnographic interviews with 21 families, that is, the parents and the grandparents of the children. These interviews were videoed and have been transcribed in Thai and then translated into English by another research assistant, Natida Patawaratum. Unfortunately, we haven't had time yet to do the full qualitative data analysis using in vivo, so the following slides are based on Natida's preliminary notes on her observations. First of all, what are the learning resources available to people? First of all, family members, which is good in terms of intergenerational transmission, which is what we're interested in, as well as members of the immediate family. Of course, children and other people also learn from fellow members of the community, such as neighbours, friends, and school friends. They also learn a fair amount through education, which we hope so. And we can look at education in a much broader sense than simply going to school, looking at non-formal and informal education. I'll talk about that on the next slide. And fourthly, the internet and social media are increasingly used. The village does have internet connections, and young people particularly are using those. So, botanical knowledge and local wisdom, which is one of the ways that local wisdom is how traditional ecological knowledge is referred to often in Thailand. First of all, we have what might be called non-formal education, the traditional way that children learnt traditional ways of life, which is observation. Children observe their elders doing activities and they ask questions. And then they might practice, learning by doing, learning by trial and error. And then, of course, there's word-of-mouth communication. So people will give tips to each other. If one family discovers a useful tip for growing rice, they might pass it on to other families, and therefore traditional ways of doing things might change. There are several factors which affect the learning of traditional ecological knowledge. First of all, there's age. This is what one might call an empty village, in that mainly it is older people, the grandparent generation, and younger people, young people, I mean children who will be living in the village. The younger adults, the parental generation, mostly go and work in the city because basically a need for economic income. And also they are really interested in getting more world experience. They don't want their life to be limited to the village anymore. Education also plays a part, number two. And we find that people with a higher level of education are more likely to go to work in the city, and therefore are not so likely to follow farming as their way of life in the future. Thirdly, we have the economic circumstances of the family. If a family is very poor, members of the family are forced to take on extra work, which is often low-paid work, such as feeding silkworms or weaving flower garlands. If you've been to Thailand, you know that you see these in markets. They're often used as offerings in temples or to guests to show respect, and also as souvenirs. Fourthly, there are beliefs and personal preference, and several families express the point of view that really it's up to individuals whether or not they're interested in learning traditional ecological knowledge. They're not going to push it on their kids. Some people took that further, stating that no one's interested in that old stuff anymore. And some also pointed out that if someone is very strictly Buddhist, they don't want to kill animals, which the silkworm trade involves. So they won't get involved in the silkworm trade, and therefore the knowledge about that particular industry and how to grow mulberry trees, etc., are not passed on. And mulberry trees can also be used for food for humans as well. Fifthly, we have social change of technology. Travel is increasingly easy. It's easy to go to the city. Children can go there for further and higher education. And as I mentioned, there is internet connectivity, and people increasingly turn to the internet as their primary source of knowledge rather than talking to their grandparents, for example, or looking to traditional sources of knowledge. And I think we need to be careful not to essentialize people who live in rural areas. They are just as interested in the outside world as we are. And people increasingly don't want to be limited to living in a country village and limited in terms of their careers to farming. And I think this relates to attitudes. These two last points on this slide, particularly, I'm going to be taking these further when I look at the in vivo data in particular, because I think attitudes towards traditional knowledge, traditional language are key in take-up of materials and language revitalization activities. Thank you.
To summarize, the recognition task and the interviews with the children showed that they have a substantial amount of knowledge of the plants in their immediate environment. And although we designed the tasks in these experiments to bypass language, focusing on the knowledge itself, the plants of the Taka forests are known and referred to in Northern Khmer. Our study also highlights the important role of grandparents, people of older generations, in the transmission of knowledge. We also found that socioeconomic factors play a larger part in transmission of language and knowledge than we had previously taken into account. So, where are we going from here? Considering that not all knowledge is encoded in language, it may be embedded in the practices themselves, and also that in multilingual contexts, speakers are conscious of language hierarchies. And it is important to open up new possibilities for language use. Already the project has created a talking book, a resource that is easily and cheaply produced based on Elan and Flex using PowerPoint. On seeing this book, the primary school principal has indicated that she is interested in using it and in developing more resources for Northern Khmer revitalization. The results of this study will provide the scaffolding for developing these resources.
Nên đơm bui nhỉ nè.
Ní hai cái hao thật đơm đỏ tua phải phéo. Về sợ về cha hơi cần che hơi. Xuân mang hơi kỳ niệm dùng vô trôi cái chơi về một chúa.
Đơm về thôm à?
Đơm về mình sao thôm là tê.
Là sna đơm về yang vừa ra.
Cha yang vừa cái tà miền, yang cơn đơm mô tà về cái tà miền.
Nè, klan yang na. Miền klan na.
ក្លិនក៏ប្រាប់មិនត្រូវទេពេល
Walia yung sengor ceruk. Thơn lụa cho nó việc klan na.
វាក៏ក្លិនក្អូបតិចៗនោះហើយចា តែហូបទៅវាឆ្ងាញ់
ចា
សង្អរជ្រក់ឆ្ងាញ់
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Julia and Candide, for the really interesting presentation and the impeccable timekeeping. So we're right on schedule and we have room for a few questions. So Radu has put something in the chat, but Radu, did you have a question or was it just more of a comment? That's a really interesting comment about Blanga, but did you want to ask a question or?
Yes, if possible. Well, as a comment or as a question, I just wonder how weird or how uncommon that is. Sorry, do you want me to ask the question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, go on.
So make the comment. In Blanga, the language I'm studying on Santa Isabel, they have individual names only for plants with edible fruit, or that are somehow what are otherwise useful for something else. And this is only a tiny percentage of the abundant tropical vegetation there. Everything else is simply flower, tree, leaf, or grass. So you have yellow flower, red flower, big tree, small tree, no individual word for fern, for instance. And I was recently contacted by a botanist working on the origin and spread of hibiscus in the Pacific and who wanted some linguistic evidence based on the names of the plants in different regions, probably to reconstruct the, I don't know, the migration, the spread patterns of the plant or the original name or something, or the place of origin. And I couldn't reply because in Blanga, hibiscus is red flower or yellow flower, or very rarely hibiscus. That's by the name. So how weird is that and how uncommon? I know it's not related to your research, but I just wanted to mention this. And if you have come across such examples any other time.
Personally, no, I'm not an ethnobotanist, and I think you'd have to ask an ethnobotanist that question. I do know an ethnobotanist if you're interested, or if they want to put them in touch. It's interesting because you can, of course, drink hibiscus tea, so it's not a plant that's not edible.
But Radu, one thing that I can say, this isn't about the Thai project, but in Jaminjong Yaringman, the languages I've worked on in Australia, the things that are not used are just called useless. So the plant, there's a generic term for useless plant, and that just covers everything that is not useful. So it's not exactly the same case as you've got, but I suppose it must happen.
You know, a particular tree that is used for houses or canoes will probably have a name, but everything else will be tree, not useless, but that's even...
Well, that's how they translated it to me, but let's say generic, not used.
Yeah. But the phenomenon is the same. They name only what they use and everything else is, you know, not even firm.
Okay, thank you.
So Peter has a comment on Radu's comment. Peter, go on.
I think we have to be careful about anecdotal comments like this. There's actually quite a lot of work on ethnobiology and ethnobotany. So look at other different sources. I mean, one of the things way back in the 1970s, the late Bob Lachlan was talking about knowledge of plants and so on with tzotzil, and what he pointed out was it varies enormously within communities. Some people know all about the names of plants, and other people couldn't give a damn about plants.
Yes.
So you ask them, what's that? And they say, oh, it's a red flower. But other people might actually be much more concerned about it for lots and lots of different reasons. So, I mean, there's nice stuff. You know, Julia knows. Ebony Dole, one of our students, has recently done work in El Salvador. And we had another student who worked in Indonesian Papua. Major distinction between plants that are domesticable, like Rados mentioned, and jungle plants so, you know, classification, categorization varies between communities and interests, and it varies between people.
Yes, okay. Yes, and thank you. Can I just go to Heather's comment there? It's exactly what Candide was saying about knowledge being encoded in practices, not just in language. Thank you.
And then we have one more question from Jessica. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, should I wait until after Heather's question or should I ask it now?
I think Heather's was more of a comment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So your research is so interesting to me. Thank you for the presentation. So I was wondering, did this project grow more out of community member concerns directly, like community members saying like, oh, we're losing this knowledge, or rather observations about knowledge being lost and concerns coming out of that, like the result of that?
Yeah, this project is really a response to the wishes expressed by the community. So people at Rilka, so it wasn't us, it was people, our Thai colleagues have done work for more than 10, 15 years in the village. And this project particularly came as, it's a response to a wish expressed by the villagers to document their knowledge of the forest. So it is really community, grassroots based. Yeah,
oh, that's wonderful. I love to see that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it happens because of sort of sort of evolving out of the documentation work that has been done before.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. And the villagers too have developed their own kind of manual of plants and plant names, and separately from the one that Candide was showing us too.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. That was really fascinating. And we will now move on to the final talk in the session. And thank you so much, Candide, for the heroic effort of getting up in the middle of the night to be with us. We really appreciate that. So we are now going to go on to the final talk in this panel. Janette Thambyrajah from the University of Sydney, who is going to speak about the use of Australian Aboriginal schema in Australian Aboriginal children's books. Janette?
Thank you, Lily. I'm just getting myself organised here. And just go to a full screen mode. And right, I'm assuming you can see my screen. Good, thank you. So, good morning from Sydney, Australia. It's quite early in the morning here, and good afternoon to everyone in Britain and from various other parts of the world. So my name is Janette Thambyrajah, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Sydney. Originally, I was doing critical participatory research in the New South Wales Aboriginal language on literacy. However, COVID-19 has made that a little bit difficult because most of the communities, regardless of whether they have to be on or not, they're being very careful about COVID and restricting their movements. So I've consequently made a switch to a desk study, and so now I'm researching Australian Aboriginal children's books and just analysing the books themselves. In this presentation, I'm speaking about story schemata within the children's books, which are aimed at the preschool age through to about the 4th year of schooling. My research question is this: are Aboriginal schemata present in Aboriginal children's books? This represents just a small part of my total research. Although there's been considerable work done by various researchers on the use of schemata in Aboriginal languages, there has been little research done on the use of Aboriginal story schemata in children's books, in Aboriginal children's books. So I've used the work of researchers such as Malcolm, Sharifian, Walsh and Klaproth, and I've analysed a selection of Australian Aboriginal children's books and to identify features of Australian Aboriginal schemata within them. So first of all, let me just define what I mean. For the purpose of my research, I've defined an Aboriginal children's book as one that has been authored or co-authored by an Australian Aboriginal person and also has heritage language words in it. So they're language of origin. So within Australia, I'm sure you would be aware that there's quite a large variation in the level of heritage language available to Aboriginal people. So in the eastern states, there's been a lot more destruction of the language as opposed to the Northern Territory and the Western state of Western Australia. So some books have quite considerable amount of heritage language within them, and some will only have a small amount. A story schemata is a pattern or a language structure that makes it easier for the listener or reader to make sense of the narrative. In the Western world, for instance, the common schema for a narrative is orientation, complication, and resolution. In other words, a story like Cinderella follows this schema. The cast in Cinderella is Cinderella herself and her evil stepmother and stepsisters. She's badly treated, which is obviously the complication, and what's more, she would like to go to the ball. The fairy godmother comes to the rescue, and in the end, the prince finds her, and all is well. Westerners are very familiar with this format and know what to expect, even if occasionally the resolution is not a happy one. On the other hand, when a Westerner listens to an Aboriginal narrative, one that's translated to English, they may find themselves thinking or feeling that the story didn't go anywhere, or that it didn't have a satisfactory ending, or that it had way too much repetition. However, for the Aboriginal person listening to the narrative, I would guess that they would understand many references to the shared unspoken knowledge and the connection to country that is implied rather than spoken. Schemata occasionally also overlap in the same story or are sometimes embedded in each other. So it's not always straightforward, but as for instance, a Dreamtime narrative may also be about the rules of marriage, or a family narrative may also be about the story of an initiation test. I've chosen 3 schemata just for the purpose of today, although there are many others. The first schema I've chosen to speak about is the dreaming or the dream time. This category is the largest group of the children's narratives that I've examined, and I think that they're in written form to partly assist cultural preservation, but they would be traditionally told to the children by older generations. Although they present as children's books, they also appear to be a knowledge house of cultural information for all generations. The second schema that I've chosen is a hunting schema. Within this hunting schema, there may be many repetitions of phrases or sentences. For instance, it may refer to various attempts to catch suitable fish at different locations along a coastline, and include what seems to be irrelevant detail and repetition. For an Aboriginal person, the storyline may hold many levels of interesting information. The information is not always freely, equally available to everyone in Aboriginal communities, but it may be revealed to each of them according to their level of maturity or initiation. the same story can have different levels of meaning to different people. And the third schema that I've chosen is family schema. And this schema seems to be based on stories of family, of extended family, and experience-based. It also includes stories of colonization experiences and their impacts. So here I've just outlined what I think is pretty much a generic version of a Dreamtime story schema. At the beginning, you'd likely have description of characters where they might be named and the relationship to each other is described. Then there might be some degree of conflict. The conflict may relate to the disobedience of the law or disagreements over marriage arrangements or other similar matters. Then there is also likely to be a high level of connection to country. Lots of detail about country or people or animals or conversations. And then there might be a death or some form of transformation. So the ancestors or people might be killed or transformed into a bird, an animal, a rock or a rock formation or something similar. Other items might also transform into a plant. And the ending might be quite an unhappy ending or dissatisfying, unlike what you would expect in a Western ending. So just sort of, sometimes it seems quite puzzling, in fact. Here are just a couple of examples of Dreamtime stories with Dreamtime or dreaming schema. And for instance, the story of Jet and Nuk Nuk follows the Dreamtime schema with the characters introduced as the son, the father, and the grandfather. After the son catches fish and returns to camp, he refuses to share it with his father. So there's the conflict. His father goes fishing and catches fish and cooks it and refuses to share it with the son because the son refused to share his. Then the son cries and cries and consequently turns into a sea eagle. The father turns into a bird so that they can fly together because he's also sad. And then the grandfather, who's sad, also turns into a sea eagle and flies with them. And in the end, all three are flying together looking for fish together. So you can see how this roughly follows the Dreamtime schema, but how it would also be an unsatisfying story from a Western perspective. And I suspect that there's not enough knowledge in the evident in the story itself for us to have full appreciation of what's behind it. The hunting schema. So the hunting schema are described by Malcolm and Riffian. I'm just going to move this over here. As having these parts. So the participants are described. There's general observation of the environment and animals around them. There is the pursuit of the animal, the capture and the killing of the prey, and possible eating at the end. Now, in terms of children's books, I have found this particular one, which is a delightful story, No Way Eureka Pie. And it's co-created actually between some children and a well-known author, Alison Lester. And it exhibits a hunting schema. But in this case, it's a bit of a twist on the traditional hunting schema, as it's the crocodile that's hunting and the crocodile that's eaten in the end. There's another book that has a suggestion of a hunting schema, although a very vague suggestion, and that's I Saw, We Saw, which again is a co-created book and it has lots of observations of animals, and it observes the sea eagle looking for prey and the dog about to catch a chicken. And the book orientates the reader to the location and that the children are telling the story. But so far, these are the only contemporary Aboriginal children's books that I've found with any reference to the hunting schema in them. So it may be that potentially the hunting schema has not fully transferred to the contemporary Aboriginal stories. But I don't know yet because I haven't completed my survey of all the Aboriginal books with language in them. It's early days yet, and I'm wondering also whether there might be a higher incidence of the hunting schema for children in the Northern Territory and Western Australia as opposed to those in the Eastern State. So the third schema that I chose was the family schema, and that's really stories of experiences in relation to the extended family and helping each other. So here are two examples with family schema in them. One of them is a story, a lovely story actually, probably for the lower primary age, and it's called When I Was Little Like You, and it's written by Mary Malbonka, and she's from, grew up in the Papunya region. I think the family schema is quite a relevant schema for current issues, as it involves experiences impacting families, and it can also be used for recollecting different periods in history that need to be recorded. For instance, When I Was Little Like You records the growing up experiences in Papunya, the extended family, the hunting, the medicine, and the tracking stories that they were taught by their families. And it also records the interactions with white people during that period. I think for these sorts of reasons that this schema may well continue. Overall, the implications of Aboriginal story schema are quite, the existence of them in Aboriginal children's books is significant, I feel. It means that when Aboriginal authors write for children, they are including some Aboriginal cultural story schemata. So I think that it is important for culturally appropriate story schemata to be introduced into the curriculum so that it will assist students from an Australian Aboriginal background, and also because it will broaden the perspective of children of a Western background as well. There have been in some areas, more so in perhaps the Northern Territory, there's been considerable work done on two-way education, and it's very, very successful, I think, in the sense that it broadens both backgrounds, perspectives, and also assists children to have a better understanding of each other's culture. So I think that there is early research that, that there's a potential from this to improve Aboriginal teaching practices for young children in Australia. And so I guess we'll see where this goes from here. As I said, I've only just begun really in this area, so I've had to change direction. So I'm looking forward to what surprises I might find as I explore the area of children's books, Aboriginal children's books written in heritage languages. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Janette. And we've got time for questions. So there's already one question from Sarah in the chat. Sarah, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question? Two questions, in fact. You can go ahead and ask both of them.
Yes, I do. I apologize for having so many questions. Thank you so much for a brilliant presentation. It was so good, hence why I just have a few things to ask.
Okay. I hope I can answer them.
Great. So my first question was, when you were talking about the different levels of meaning in stories and them being revealed to certain people with certain maturity or certain rank, I was just wondering if you meant that there's hidden meaning already in the stories that they then decode because they have that level of maturity or rank, or is it literally them excluding parts of the story dependent on who the story is being told to? Yeah, that was my first question.
So, so my experience is not broad enough to be able to answer that from my own experience, but if I one of the researchers that I've used is Michael Walsh, who actually also happens to be one of my supervisors. And but I discovered that he had a brilliant paper called 10 Postulates about, anyway, 10 Postulates about narrative, I think. And in that he goes through and he describes 10 features of Aboriginal narrative. And one of those, he says, is exophoric references, meaning they're basically references to knowledge that that most of the hearers will have, but Westerners won't have. And I wonder whether there might be that exophoric knowledge is sort of when it's revealed at different stages, that the connections are there for the people who have gone through different levels of initiation or acceptance into different stages, whether they have more depth to the stories than perhaps the younger people would not have. I'm not really sure. It might be also that certain parts are left out. I'm not really sure, but I am aware of the exophoric, the references to the background knowledge that the Westerners won't have and the younger kids won't have either.
Oh, I see. That's great. Thank you so much. I do have another question, but I realize there are other people asking questions too.
Oh, and I think we've actually got we're doing well for time. So yeah, go on.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. My other question, yeah, I've written it here, is how do researchers go about revealing the meanings you mentioned that to a Western researcher may be considered dissatisfying and they may have further deeper meaning? Is there a way for researchers to kind of uncover what those truly mean for us, or?
Well, I don't know, to be honest, but what I would guess is that, first of all, you well, perhaps certain Indigenous or Aboriginal researchers would have that knowledge. So depending on, you know, the level of teaching, cultural teaching that they've had. I think that it may be unlikely that most Western researchers these days would be given that knowledge. There'd have to be a very deep level of trust, I think, for that to happen. And some of the Dreamtime stories that I've read, it basically says it in the format that the stories are written in a way, translated in a way into English so that those meanings would be hidden, won't be revealed.
Really interesting.
So even
Thanks.
you were a trusted researcher, I suppose your responsibility would be not to reveal those deeper meanings unless you were given permission to do so.
Oh, I see. Thank you so much. That's really, really fascinating.
We've got a question from Cassie. Would you like to ask it?
Sure, I was absolutely fascinated by that, and especially the collaborative project in the Niue Yikipai story.
Oh, yes. That's a great book.
Yeah, and just mixing you're mixing the languages, so it looks like to me English and the Aboriginal language. So that's one really interesting thing. And the second one is the collaborative nature between the children and the author. And I'm just wondering, are there more examples of that within your corpus?
Yes, there are a number of books that have been done in a collaborative way, which personally I really love. So the Literacy Foundation, Indigenous Literacy Foundation, seem to have some of those. So so this one we saw, that's one.
Okay.
That's Indigenous Literacy Foundation. Then there's this one here, which is by students from Balanya School. Again, Indigenous Literacy Foundation. So I think in the eastern regions where the languages are not as stable as some of the Northern Territory and Western Australian languages, one of the strategies has been to use the English sentence and then just put the certain words into the sentence, which has got its pluses and minuses, but at least it's communicating something of the language.
Yeah, and I mean, if the children, depending on how much input the children have, you know, that valorizes their particular creativity abilities. So that's just a great example. Thanks so much for that.
My pleasure.
Could I quickly ask a follow-up question to that? I was wondering, it could be that you explained some of this and I missed it, but whether you have like kind of percentages of how many of the books tend to be like bilingual or multilingual, and how many of them are in English, and what the sort of language makeup is around them.
Yeah, no, I haven't finished my statistics on that. So sorry. Yeah, so I'm currently working through just collecting the books themselves is quite a task. Just finding, so that, you know, isn't any one place that's got, you know, a whole lot of, you know, the complete list of books in language. So, yeah. You know, that's been quite an interesting task in itself. And, so definitely there are, so more, it sort of seems to be the impact of colonization has had a huge impact on the books that are written in fully in language, bilingual, or so. It's very, I think it's pretty rare. I haven't really. Oh, so there are a number of online books as well, and the Living Archive of Aboriginal Languages, which is an online app that has books that are completely written in Indigenous languages. But I think most printed books seem to be in bilingual. Some are, can be quite extensively written in like, you know, a full page of heritage language with the translation on the side. So it's interesting to see how the prominence also of the heritage language or the English language. I'm not sure whether I quite answered your question there, but
yeah, that's I mean, yeah, like you said, it's if you haven't finished yet, then you haven't got all of the statistics,
Yeah,
but that gives a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
thank you so much. That was really interesting. Okay, we've got a question from Peter. Would you like to ask it? And then I think that will be our last question.
Yeah, I was just curious whether you consider Creole to be an Aboriginal language and whether that's part of what you're looking at, because I think there are actually some really interesting literacy things happening in Creole that are not happening in, say, quote, traditional languages.
Yeah. I haven't got as far as Creole yet, but I don't see any reason why. Yeah, I mean, it's a Creole, but it's still, I would still consider examining that yet. I just haven't got that far yet. Yeah.
Excellent. And there's some comments from Christine in the chat as well about it looks like other resources and books which are relevant. So yeah, I recommend everyone have a look at those. Thank you so much, Janette, and thank you to all of the speakers in this really, really exciting, fascinating panel. And I know because the schedule is so packed, we don't have as much time for discussion as we'd like, but like, please, if you have a, if you take some time out and have a break, then like do go to the break room and continue chatting more informally. So we've got sort of two different options now. For those of you who are feeling, flagging a bit, we have got a break slot scheduled, but in that time there's going to be a film screening. So if you'd like to see the film, you can just stay in this room, and that's going to start in a minute, and that goes on for an hour. But then if you feel like you need a break, then please do take this time to have a break, because the next hour there won't be any presentations. It will be the film. Okay, so thanks again to everyone, and I'm just going to see if the director of the film is here, who's going to start the screening. Sandrine, you're here, and Florian, you're here as well. So I'm just going